Now, here in the UK, King Charles has thanked everyone who sent him messages of support since his cancer diagnosis.
Britain is shaking tonight. Moments ago, the royal intervention that many hoped would calm the nation has completely collapsed. And instead of peace, it has triggered an eruption of anger, fear and nationwide unrest that is spreading faster than anyone can control. Streets are filling, voices are rising, and the government has been caught completely off guard as the situation spirals into something far darker than anyone expected. This is not a warning. This is not a prediction. This is happening right now. And the fallout is only beginning. It started with a single announcement from the palace, a carefully worded message meant to cool tensions after weeks of frustration building across the country. People were tired, angry and demanding answers, and many believed a royal intervention would finally break the political deadlock gripping the nation. But instead of reassuring the public, the message had the opposite effect. Within minutes, the calm that leaders hoped for began to fracture. The words meant to unify were seen by many as distant, disconnected, and far too late to address the pressure already boiling across Britain. As the statement spread across social media, reactions turned fierce. Large groups began gathering in towns and cities, demanding action rather than symbolism. The government remained silent, hoping the royal message would work on its own. But that silence only fueled more speculation and suspicion. People felt abandoned, ignored, left without direction as the country drifted into uncertainty. The royal appeal, once considered the last card to bring stability, now looked like a desperate move that had fallen apart before it even had a chance to take effect. Across the nation, frustration began turning into movement in London, Manchester, Birmingham, and beyond. Crowds formed rapidly, not organised, not coordinated, but driven by something deeper. The fear that no one in power truly understood what ordinary people were facing. The collapse of the royal intervention wasn't just a failure. For many, it was the final sign that the country was sliding into something uncontrollable. Videos began circulating online showing thousands pouring into the streets, their voices echoing through city centres as police scrambled to keep up. Inside government offices, the reaction was immediate panic. Officials who had quietly relied on the royal message to calm public emotions were now watching the opposite unfold. The collapse meant they had no backup plan, no strategy to regain control. Advisors rushed into emergency meetings, but even behind closed doors, confusion took over. No one could agree on how to respond or who should address the nation next. Every minute of silence from leaders made the unrest, HRS, grow louder and the tension thickened like a storm cloud ready to explode. Meanwhile, the palace itself remained unusually quiet. After the earlier message failed to land, there were no follow-ups, no clarifications, nothing to ease the confusion spreading through the country. This silence only intensified public frustration. Many people began questioning whether the intervention was sincere, if it was coordinated with the government, or if the entire move had been rushed in desperation. The more unanswered questions appeared, the more rapidly anger grew. By the time night fell, the atmosphere across Britain had transformed. Roads that were silent hours earlier now echoed with chants. Live streams from citizens surged across the internet, each one painting the same picture. The situation was no longer just political disagreement, it was escalation. The sense of control, already fragile, snapped completely as the royal attempt to restore order crumbled in front of the entire nation. The collapse wasn't symbolic, it was visible, public and impossible to ignore. People watching from home described feeling a strange mix of shock and inevitability. For weeks, they had sensed something building, something heavy pressing on the country, but no one expected the turning point to arrive this suddenly. As Britain erupted into unpredictable unrest, one question started to rise above the chaos. If the royal intervention couldn't calm the nation, what or who could? The eruption that followed was not a slow burn, it was instant. Within minutes of the royal intervention collapsing, Britain shifted from tense to volatile. Crowds that had gathered out of frustration were now moving with purpose, driven by a feeling that the entire system had failed them at once. What was supposed to be a moment of unity had instead opened a deep fault line across the nation, and that fault line was widening by the hour. Streets that were once filled with ordinary daily life now felt charged. unpredictable, and on the brink of something far more explosive. Reports began emerging from different regions, each one painting the same picture, confusion turning into confrontation. In some areas, authorities attempted to calm people through short statements and rushed briefings, but the responses had no effect. The public mood had shifted. Words were no longer enough. People were demanding clear answers, real action and immediate accountability, so things no leader seemed prepared to offer. The collapse of the royal plan was being interpreted by many as proof that the country's leadership had no grip on the crisis at all. In major cities, tensions intensified rapidly. Groups that had initially gathered to express frustration soon found themselves face to face with overwhelmed officials who had no unified strategy. Miscommunications spread like wildfire. Some believed the government was hiding information. Others were convinced something larger was unfolding behind closed doors. In times of uncertainty, speculation filled every gap, and the lack of clear direction only made that speculation louder and more dangerous. By now, the atmosphere wasn't just unstable, but it was deeply fragmented. Inside the government, the chaos was even more shocking. Those who had counted on the royal intervention to calm public pressure were left scrambling. Suddenly, every department was pointing fingers. Some blamed the timing, others blamed poor coordination. A few insisted they had warned this would happen, but their voices had been ignored. The more they argued internally, the less they addressed the rapidly growing unrest outside their walls. It became painfully clear that the collapse of the royal message wasn't just a public relations disaster. It had exposed layers of mismanagement that had been building for months. Meanwhile, across social platforms, the reaction was like nothing the country had seen in years. Videos of crowds chanting in the streets, clips of government spokespersons avoiding questions, and posts questioning the palace's role filled the digital space in minutes. The real-time pressure online made the situation harder to contain. Every second, new voices added fuel to the storm. People who had remained silent in the early stages of the crisis were now stepping in, demanding explanations from leaders who were nowhere to be seen. Influencers, commentators and activists all poured their own interpretations into the mix, blurring the line between facts, fears and assumptions. As the night grew darker, the tension took on a life of its own. It wasn't just about the failed intervention anymore. It was about years of frustration rising to the surface all at once. The royal collapse had become a symbol, a moment people rallied around to express their anger about everything else they felt had been ignored. In this atmosphere, even small incidents felt amplified. A minor argument in one city could trigger major unrest in another. Rumours spread faster than officials could debunk them. Every message, every sound, every movement felt like it could spark the next escalation. By midnight, Britain was no longer simply reacting. It was erupting. The government attempted to coordinate an emergency response, but divisions inside leadership slowed every decision. Some leaders pushed for strong measures, others insisted that doing so would only provoke more unrest. The result was paralysis. As they hesitated, the situation outside continued to spiral. People who had been asking for help earlier were now demanding answers with urgency, feeling completely cut off from those meant to lead them. Through all this, one detail stood out. The public was no longer waiting for official statements. They weren't looking to the palace or the government to fix the situation. For the first time in a long time, people were acting on their own, forming their own conclusions, making their own moves. The collapse of the royal intervention had cracked something deeper: the remaining trust that institutions could manage a national crisis. And now, with the unrest spreading across multiple regions and no clear authority stepping forward, Britain was moving into a phase more unpredictable than anything seen so far. The eruption had only begun, and what came next depended on forces that no leader seemed prepared to control. As dawn approached, the scale of the unrest became undeniable. What began as scattered crowds and sudden outbursts had transformed into a nationwide wave of defiance, stretching from the busiest city centres to the quietest rural towns. People were no longer reacting to a single failed intervention. They were reacting to the feeling that every promise, every reassurance, every authority figure had let them down. The collapse of the royal message was simply the spark. The deeper fire had been burning for far longer, and now it was raging in full view of the world. Local authorities struggled to keep up. In some regions, officials attempted calm negotiations, hoping that early dialogue might prevent escalation. But in many cases, even measured responses were drowned out by the overwhelming pressure from crowds who believed the time for gentle words had passed. The lines between peaceful expression and raw frustration blurred, creating unpredictable moments where calm could shatter without warning. No one knew where the next outbreak would occur. No one knew how far it would spread. Every hour added a new layer of uncertainty. Inside the government's crisis rooms, the tension was suffocating. Ministers who were once confident and composed now found themselves speaking in panicked fragments, unsure of what steps to take or how to regain control. Reports were coming in too quickly to process. Advisors were arguing over priorities. Some demanded that the Prime Minister address the nation immediately, while others insisted that another speech would only inflame the situation. Even the most experienced officials admitted privately they had never seen the country unravel like this. Not so quickly, not so completely, and not with such a deep sense of betrayal running through the public mood. As the pressure grew, leaks began pouring out of government offices. Anonymous messages, screenshots, whispered notes, all suggesting that leadership had been caught unprepared, that warnings had been ignored, that major departments had been operating without coordination for weeks. Whether these leaks were true or exaggerated didn't matter. They spread faster than any official correction could. And each leak further convinced the public that the royal intervention hadn't collapsed by accident. It had collapsed because the system supporting it was already broken. Meanwhile, the palace found itself in an unfamiliar position. Usually shielded from direct political chaos, it now stood at the centre of the storm. The failed intervention raised questions that no one inside the royal circle seemed ready to answer. Why had the message been released so suddenly? Why had it contained vague reassurances without concrete actions? Why was there complete silence afterward? These questions echoed across news programmes, social media and public gatherings. For the first time in years, the royal institution seemed uncertain, unprepared and unable to ease rising tensions. Each hour of silence only deepened the perception that something had gone terribly wrong behind the scenes. Across the streets, a strange mix of determination and doubt filled the air. People stood shoulder to shoulder, not entirely sure what they wanted to happen next, but absolutely certain they would not return home until something changed. The collapse of the intervention had shifted the national mood into something more powerful than frustration. It had become a refusal to accept the status quo. Ordinary citizens who rarely engaged in public demonstrations were now marching, chanting, demanding transparency. Each new group added its own voice to the growing chorus, turning local unrest into a national movement. Meanwhile, misinformation began to weave itself into the chaos. With official statements scarce and clarity in short supply, rumours spread like lightning. Some claimed new restrictions were secretly being drafted. Others whispered that high-ranking officials were preparing to resign. A few insisted that the palace was planning another message but feared it would worsen the situation. None of these claims had solid evidence, but in moments of uncertainty, rumours held as much power as truth. They shaped decisions, redirected crowds, and heightened anxiety across regions already stretched to the breaking point. Businesses closed early, public transport routes were disrupted, emergency lines were flooded by calls from people desperate for guidance. In hospitals, staff prepared for potential surges in injuries, unsure if they were ready for what the night might bring. Schools sent out messages warning parents of possible closures. Every institution, big or small, braced for the unknown because the country no longer felt predictable. It felt like a storm building pressure with no visible eye. Throughout all of this, one chilling theme echoed everywhere: leadership was missing. The royal collapse had left a vacuum at the very centre of national stability, and no one had stepped in to fill it. Without a clear voice, the unrest took on a direction of its own, driven by anger, fear, exhaustion, and a growing belief that no authority could be trusted. As the third wave of unrest surged across Britain, people realised this was no longer a brief crisis or a moment of national disagreement. This was a turning point, a fracture, a moment that would be remembered for years, not for what caused it, but for what it revealed. And as the sun rose over a country still shaking, one question echoed louder than all the chants, all the rumours and all the fears. If the royal intervention could collapse so easily, what else in Britain was about to fall next?